Good afternoon.
Hey, hello.
Welcome to the Carnegie Endowment. It's a great pleasure to have you all here. My name is Alper Coşkun. I'm a senior fellow with the Europe program at the Carnegie Endowment. And I want to welcome you all to our event this afternoon, which will focus on Turkey and different aspects of Turkish foreign policy. This is an event that is basically the culmination point of a project that we have run at the Carnegie Endowment with the participation of 7 other scholars that has focused on different themes that are interrelated yet separate, and attempted to stitch these different themes together. 4 of the contributors to this effort will be on the panel, including myself, but I want to recognize 4 other scholars who have also contributed to this effort, who will not be on the panel. From our Carnegie Europe office, Mark Chiarini, Francesco Sicardi. From our office in Berlin, Temur Umarov, who also contributed. And finally, I'm looking for him Sofia Besh. She might not be here right now, from our office here in DC, who I work with together in the Europe program. This is a project that focused on, as I mentioned, 4 different main issues, interrelated issues. One had to do with the geopolitical evolution that is going on in Europe post-Ukraine, and its implications, obviously, for Turkey. And we try to bring that into the transatlantic context by making sense of what that might mean for transatlantic relations and, obviously, by extension, to the United States. And we did a similar effort in terms of Turkey's relations with China, Turkey's relations with Russia, and the almost concurrent effort of the European Union and Turkey to pursue what they both refer to as strategic autonomy. We looked for convergences and, again, implications for the transatlantic relationship. And I think our scholars will drill deeper into the details of our findings, but we do see the realities of a multipolar world order reading taking place from Ankara, Turkey trying to reposition itself, if you will, in this new world order, and the inherent tensions that that brings to Turkey's decades-long ties to the West by virtue not only of NATO, but other institutions, and it's currently frozen yet politically significant and economically very meaningful accession aspiration and relations with the European Union. So I'll leave it at that. We have a wonderful panel, and we have a wonderful moderator who I want to thank especially for being here with us, Stefanie Bolzen, who is the Washington correspondent for the Welt and the Welt and Sonntag. I practiced the pronunciation a little bit. I hope I got it right. She is an acclaimed journalist and an acclaimed writer. She's broken a lot of exclusive stories, and she might hatch a new one because she's on the trail watching the election campaign. So after this event, you might want to hound her a little bit to see what the scoop is as far as the feeling on the street is concerned. Thank you all again for coming. I will pass it over to Stefanie, and we can start our events.
Yeah, thank you very much. Is that working? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. I'm first of all, thank you very much, and I'm delighted to share this panel. And as a German born in the 70s in the very west of Western Germany, I always thought of my country being the center of Europe. And then some years later, I was a young reporter, and I covered the former communist countries. And I remember a conversation with a Romanian politician who said, no, Romania is the center of Europe. Why am I saying this? Because what I think what makes Carnegie's Turkey and the World Project so interesting is the unique perspective, or rather the change of perspective. Looking at Turkey as a global focal point because of her geostrategic, geopolitical, and I dare say geocultural significance. Her relations with the EU, of course, we will talk about, with China, and especially now these days with Russia. These are consequential for transatlantic relations, for the US, and of course for Turkey as a NATO member for 72 years. I will start asking each panelist about their papers, the specific papers within this project, and then finishing with, let's say, some more journalistic questions. And then, of course, we would very much like to invite you as an audience to ask questions. And it's really, we talked about that last night, it's really important for us that you ask questions because we want to make this panel very much relevant for a Washington-based US audience. So I'll start with Sinan and one of your many papers on Turkish strategic autonomy. And there was one sentence in there that really struck me. It said, Turkey no longer feels beholden to a US-led Western-dominated agenda. What does Turkish strategic autonomy mean, and especially for NATO?
Thank you, Stefanie. A pleasure to be here with all of you. I was one of the co-authors of this paper on Turkish strategic autonomy. And the reason why I really want to do that bit is that I find this transformation quite fascinating for a host of reasons. So I wanted to share some of those reasons with you in terms of fundamentally how I think Turkey is repositioning itself in the world and how it is reconceptualizing its role in the world. This is what strategic autonomy is about. Now, it is not unique to Turkey. You'll hear more from Ilke a bit later about our other partner, the EU's aspirations for strategic autonomy. But in the Turkish context, this is driven by a number of different and sometimes conflicting fundamentals. The first one, which is perhaps similar to the EU perception of the world as well, is the belief that the post-war, multilateral, US-centric, if not to say Western-centric, world is over or is about to be eclipsed. And here, obviously, there's a nuance between people like me who look at the world and think that, be that as it may, this is still a long-term project. I mean, right now, when you look at the world, those things haven't really happened at the pace that perhaps some other people think. But definitely, the trajectory is clear. So that is one driver about how the post-war unipolar moment is over, US hegemony is over. Secondly, and somewhat tied to that, is that over the years, Turkey's own relationship with some of these Western powers, be it the US or the EU, have been tarnished. There are a number of difficulties that we just cannot address. And that has created a degree of frustration at home, which has somewhat facilitated the political atmospherics for advancing this alternative narrative of strategic autonomy. Because let's be clear, the previous version of, version 1.0 of how Turkey conceptualized its role in the world was a very firm, solid member of the Western alliance. That is not anymore the case. And part of that reason, apart from how the world is moving and these geopolitical shocks, has to do with the difficulties that we experienced with our main partners, the US and the EU. Some of them, I would say, and here I think the responsibility is to be shared. Some of them have to do with the fact of the erosion of fundamental rights, democratic rule at home. But others have to do with, with the strategic myopia, I would say, of the European Union in basically boiling down everything in our relationship to the Cyprus problem, the perhaps way that the US decided to advance its objectives in the Middle East, which in our sense has been very inimical, starting with the intervention in Iraq and its consequences, and Syria nowadays. So all of these problems have been another driver. And the third driver of this has been a purely domestic agenda of the AK Party government wanting to delineate itself from previous narratives, which were much more close, a country that's much more closely aligned with the West. Now the narrative is, in a way, almost like India and Brazil. The country that can operate as if it's not been part of these Western institutions. And that is the core tension, which I'll come back to, because ultimately we're not India, we're not Brazil. We are a member of NATO. We are founding members of the Council of Europe, despite all the difficulties on the rule of law. we are not anymore in Eurovision, but we used to be. We are OECD. Our teams play in, in European soccer competitions and so on and so forth. When you look at the economy, that's even more true. 50% of our exports go to Europe. We get more than 80% of our foreign direct investment from what I would call the geographical West. So not only the EU, but also US, Japan, Korea. And that is the case also for technology and finance. So in actual fact, we are very much and very deeply entangled with the Western institutional structures. And that is the core tension inherent in Turkey's aspirations for strategic autonomy. Because if you don't acknowledge that and try to be India and Brazil, then these tensions start to rise to the surface. And we see many examples of this, starting with the S-400 debacle, and we can talk about that even now, the application to join BRICS. So I will leave it there just to give you, on the surface, how I think about Turkey's strategic autonomy.
You talked about the domestic agenda of this. Are there any ideological drivers behind that?
I would say yes, because let's not be naive. From 1923 onwards, foreign policy had also a domestic role. The reason why the founding fathers of the modern Turkish Republic decided to invest in this relationship was that their vision for the future of Turkish society was very much similar to what they saw and what they wanted to accomplish in terms of values that they saw as part of the West. So that is the ideational, in a way, driver of foreign policy, which has been the case from the beginning. Now it has a different ideational driver. So the overall philosophy of the AK Party government is that, well, Turkey is not necessarily part of the Western civilization. It is almost a civilizational discourse. That's not necessarily bad or good, but it's just a fact, they say, that we are the inheritors of a different legacy, the Ottoman legacy. Our Muslim identity has to be more prevalent, and therefore our foreign policy has to serve also that purpose of rebuilding Turkish identity at home. So in that sense, yes, there's an ideological driver.
And since we are here in the US and in Washington, one number I found in your paper, and of course that was the paper you wrote with Sophia, that 67% of Turkish citizens think that the US, quote, plays a negative role in the international arena. And that was in 2022, so quite long before October 7. What does that mean for the trust between Turkey and the US?
Well, I mean, when you look at poll after poll, it's very, flagrant that the trust has been eroded to such a great degree. And I would say mutually so. I suppose that when people are polled here, Turkey is not anymore the stalwart ally that it used to be in years past. So the fact that mutual trust has been eroded is, as I've tried to argue, is also facilitates this narrative that, we're not part of the West because the West is not loyal to us. And we saw this very clearly in the discussions about Russia sanctions. When there was discussion about whether Turkey should actually apply the Russia sanctions, the response that you would get talking to people in Ankara, why? What do we get in return? The West has been disloyal to us. Look at the US, it's undermining our security interest in Syria by siding with the YPG. So why should we be loyal to the West just because they want us to be?
If I may continue with you, Sasha. You wrote one of the papers or many papers, but one of recent papers on Turkey and Russia. And we know the entanglement and the very complex relationship, especially with the backdrop of Ukraine. Could you explain to us how Turkey strikes this balance, especially with the backdrop of Russia and the war on Ukraine?
I think that the relationship has multiple pillars, and it's a centuries-long entanglement. But with Putin and Erdogan, you found some balance where there is a lot of pull in the relationship. You have an economic pillar that hasn't been there for many years and centuries, that hasn't been there during the Cold War, but it's there. Russia is the largest supplier of natural gas, and it's a cheap commodity for Turkey. It's builder of the nuclear power plant. It's still a giant market for agricultural goods. And that's something where both sides are benefiting from that. And that changed due to the sanctions policy, and I'll talk about that in a minute. You have security interests that are sometimes aligned, sometimes not. But I think that both Moscow and Ankara made sure that it's pretty well compartmentalized. That's something that Russia was never able to achieve with the West. What the US was trying to tell the Russians, like, let's compartmentalize. And the Russians wanted to have a holistic view on foreign policy. It's either your enemies or partners. But with Turkey, that was managed. And I think that's managed for quite some time. I think that what's changed, really, is that for Russia now, everything in its foreign policy is subordinated to the war. Like, war is the organizing principle of Russian foreign policy. And if Russia looks at relationship with any country, it looks for three things. One, what does this relationship bring to my direct effort on the battlefield in Ukraine in terms of material? Artillery shells, components, all of that. Number two, how does this relationship help my embattled economy? Does it create new revenue streams? Does it keep the revenue streams? Does it help me to bypass financial sanctions? And three, which is increasingly important and also new, is that Russia sees its war against Ukraine as a war against the West and the US. So how do I instrumentalize a relationship in order to inflict pain on the United States of America and its partners? So Turkey definitely checks box number 2 to a large extent, and that's mutually beneficial trade. We've heard the news that Turkey will not help Russia to ship some of the components to its weapons through its territory. I believe it when I see it. And then I think that the third element, how do you instrumentalize relationship with Turkey to punish the West? That's a challenge. I think that Putin made his moves with S-400 and so on. For the time being, I think the war has brought more leverage and more options to Turkey. And that's also a new dynamics that is likely to stay for the time being as the war is ongoing. And there is a big question mark of what will happen once the hot phase of war in Ukraine, at least this chapter, is over. Turkey has much more leverage in the relationship that it used to have before Putin made his fateful decision. Remember in 2022, when Putin was about to walk out of the deal with the grain corridor, Erdogan brought Putin a couple of times into that. Well, in 23, it collapsed because Russia decided that destroying Ukrainian economy is a far loftier goal than keeping good relationship with Turkey. But for a year, Ankara managed to keep the deal together. Erdogan and Aliyev managed to have their way in South Caucasus with Karabakh, with Russia doing nothing to help its treaty ally, Armenia. Well, there are grudges in Moscow over Yerevan, but I think that's also pretty remarkable. And that's there to stay as long as Russia is bogged down in Ukraine and doesn't have bandwidth to change the situation. If the fighting stops, when the fighting stops one day, probably Russia will have a little bit more leverage to return to this balance.
Mm. And a follow-up on this, because you talk about the role that Turkey plays and played in the war, Russia's war in Ukraine. We remember I think it was in April 22, when there was Turkey helped have some negotiations or talks about a peace deal. Of course, they failed. But looking ahead, and in 2025, do you see Turkey as a key player that might be sitting at the table helping to find a peace deal, which of course makes the country very important to the US?
I'm skeptical on the peace deal in general for now, because there is not that much appetite palpable in Kyiv for the deal that they can live with. And there is no appetite in Moscow either, because for now, if you're Putin, You don't know what the outcome of this election is. You believe that time is on your side, and it's an equation where Russia has problems, and they will be mounting, but they will be much more palpable towards 2026, maybe, and then you have resources to address them. And your bet is that Ukraine will crumble before that. So continuing fighting is a rational strategy that the Russians are pursuing with all of the horrors that accompany that. And then for Russia, negotiations will be partially with Ukraine, but they want to talk to the boss. They perceive that the conflict is not with Ukraine, but with the West and with the United States. So they want to talk to the United States of America about security and about several other issues that, in their view, led to this conflict. And I think that there is no way to kind of sign a ceasefire agreement without that conversation. It will just not happen. So Turkey was one of the rare players that provided logistics for the big talks that failed, and we don't know how much Putin was invested in those talks. I think that's the key question. But Turkey is one of the rare players that remained very relevant in narrow issues, be it swaps of corpses of dead soldiers, be it prisoner swaps, the grain deal and the grain corridor around that, swaps of Russian spies arrested in various countries for American citizens, including Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich and Russian dissidents. So here, Turkey really played a very important role. Remember that when we had this nuclear scare in fall 2022, Naryshkin, the head of the Russian intelligence, and Bill Burns, our former boss and director of the CIA, spoke in Ankara. So I think that for logistical support, Turkey might be really one of the major platforms. But don't expect, because it can support the talks logistically, that it will play a role as a mediator. There is no player that can do that for the time being.
But in the policy recommendations in your paper, you say at some point that Turkey could become, quote, a security provider against Russia. Is that right? So how do you mean that?
I think that Turkey is, I think that for the foreseeable future, the Western policy on Russia will be focused on containment. No matter how the war in Ukraine ends, no matter where the line of contact will be, I think that most likely we will end up in unsatisfying cessation of hostilities that will not lead to transformation of Russia and will enable to restore or rebuild partnership on new foundation. I think that's not very likely to happen as long as Mr. Putin is in charge. And even after his departure, well, that remains to be seen when that happens. Russia may be a very transformed country. So it's far away. And building deterrence against Russia that will be restoring its military capabilities and seeking ways to inflict pain on the West, including through covert means of intelligence operations. You see all of this reports about acts of sabotage, arson, and so on. There's more in stock, and I think that it's coming. So here, Turkey, as a NATO ally, has vital interest to participate in this containment strategy. It has vital interest around the Black Sea to not see the Russians, spreading their forces into Abkhazia and so on. There are very little tools to address that. But I think that here, Turkey's interests and the US, NATO interests really align. There might be some frictions on how much the US wants to be present in the Black Sea, and we can talk about that. But I think that here, the overarching interests are really having a lot in common.
Let's briefly move away a bit from Turkey-Russia relations and look at China. How do you think does Beijing see Turkey's aspirations for strategic autonomy, and what is the entanglement there? Big question, but maybe you can break this down.
I think that Turkey is viewed in Beijing not only as a NATO member, like the Trojan horse inside NATO is really Hungary for the time being. But Turkey is just much bigger than a Western country that has its peculiar geography. It's really at the crossroads of various regions, be it South Caucasus, Central Asia, the Middle East, Southern Europe, Russia, the Black Sea. And for China, the logistics, the economy make a lot of sense. Like, for all the talk of Belt and Road, like there is a lot of kind of hot air in that. But I think that for China, being on good terms, if possible, with that key player is of paramount importance. And I think that China is strategically trying to invest into this relationship.
Mm-hmm. And lastly, on this complex, I would like to ask you something else, because you also wrote a paper on China. Why does Turkey's ambitions regarding BRICS and also the SCO, why does that, quote, complicate her role as a transatlantic player?
Well, because it creates suspicion about, where Turkey stands and where Turkey goes. And I think there is a way to achieve what the Turkish government wants to do, but we're not there yet, because ultimately this strategic autonomy, wanting to have better relations with China, Russia, can make sense for a country that has Turkey's geography. However, in order to eliminate the tensions of that this strategic autonomy creates, there is one thing that the authorities in Ankara should have done, and they haven't. And that is to dispel suspicion about what Turkey is, where it wants to stand, what sort of future it wants to have, what sort of values it wants to implement for the future of its own society. So if we are able to dispel doubts about that one, and here I'm particularly talking about democratic reforms, expansion of fundamental freedoms, then these aspirations of strategic autonomy can be more digestible, I would tend to think. Because then it wouldn't automatically lead to issues like, is Turkey part of the West? Is Turkey changing its axis? Actually, Turkey is not changing its axis, and my argument is that it can't really. There's a path dependency because of our very deep entanglement with the Western institutional structure. But however, the way that this is articulated creates tension because already there is the atmospherics of seeing Turkey as part of the West have weakened.
Let's move to the old world, to Europe.
Let's do that.
You've been co-authored, among other papers, a paper on strategic autonomy of Europe aspiring for strategic autonomy. Maybe first of all, could you explain what that is and where it comes from?
Thank you very much. And good afternoon, everyone. I would also like to use this opportunity to thank Carnegie Endowment and specifically to Alper for hosting me. It's a pleasure to be here. When we were discussing the papers in this project, we were also going through all the changes that the European Union has been going through. Because in addition to the conversations that we had about Turkey, Russia, China, the European Union itself also found a moment of transition, moment of change. And the reasons, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a major reason, but also the needs for various very strategic transitions that the European Union is facing. So we start with the green transition, tech transition, and societal transitions in Europe, connecting it to all the economic transition that is required for being resilient and competitive. This is one of the key words in Brussels and in European capitals right now. No, it's like everything is connected to competitiveness and resilience agenda. But also at the same time, while these structural changes in the economy are happening, there are various questions about three layers. And I think all these three layers are connected to Turkey's role and the connection between Turkish strategic autonomy and European strategic autonomy. The first conversation is about security and defense, because after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Europeans started to discuss once again, well, I should add, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the possibility of the United States slowly and with a Trump win more quickly shifting its priorities away from Europe. The Europeans started to discuss what kind of a future there will be on security and defense. Major investments are needed. And in addition to major investments, there's a question about how to spend more, better, and together. And all this conversation is very much linking the European Union to Turkey and to other players. The second conversation is about enlargement and reform. This was one of the hottest topics right after the war has started, because 4 days after the full-scale invasion, Ukraine, and following that, Moldova and Georgia applied for EU membership and changed the dynamics of European policies in wider Europe. In addition to that, the reform conversation got into the question because the Europeans realized that both for increasing capacity to act and also for opening space for new member states, there was a requirement to reform. And as I said in the beginning, all these agendas connected to competitiveness and resilience agenda made up in general what we can call it open strategic autonomy, we can call it a fight for resilience, we can call it a transition coupled with all the changes that are happening in the world. We have found the European Union, like all the other actors, I think this is a similar point. No? It's like this is the common feature between Turkey, the other countries of the global south, and the European Union itself, where there's a global realignment situation, and the EU itself is also trying to adjust to that.
Mm. And Turkey and Europe kind of at the same time aspiring for their strategic autonomy. Can this be complementary, or will this cause even more tensions?
Actually, this very much depends on what kind of a mindset is out there. Because right now, actually, we are in Turkey-EU relations, we are a bit stuck in a place. And it's like, as Sinan has said, there is an inherent link to Western institutions, including the European Union itself, because Turkey is still a candidate country, and Turkish officials keep on claiming and underlining that the country is a candidate country like all the others. But at the same time, while we see developments in the enlargement policy, and we have seen the naming of candidate country of Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, taking them out of this Eastern Partnership framework, well, not necessarily out of it, but mostly the treatment, improvements in Western Balkan countries, Turkey has remained a non-issue. I have heard so many officials in Brussels saying that there are 9 candidate countries, not 10. So this has created, this inherent link to Western institutions, but the reality on the ground being so different, creates an overarching tension. Then when we look at the specifics of the relationship, of course, we have the foreign policy problem, because Turkish foreign policy is perceived as at odds with the European Union and its member states. Clearly, Cyprus and Eastern Mediterranean are examples, but also positioning about sanctions, relationship with Russia, the procurement of S-400s, etc., etc. There are various questions about foreign policy, but there are also questions, as Sinan also said, about democratic backsliding in Turkey. But in my personal opinion, the democratic backsliding issue could be rediscussed if Turkey was not necessarily in the framework of the candidacy. Because the EU just celebrated Gulf Cooperation Council summit with these countries. The EU is opening up itself to rethinking its relations with third countries. But if this third country is as integrated as Turkey, then we have an issue. So answering your question, is this search for strategic autonomy on both sides is opening up an opportunity? Yes and maybe. Because yes, of course, because we are clearly going through a period where the European Union is re-evaluating all its relationships, both in wider Europe and in the world globally. And this trend will very much increase in the upcoming administration in the European Union. For one key reason, the EU has to rethink its relationship both in trade and in supply chains and as markets if it wants to remain competitive. And the conversation with Turkey, conversations with Africa, conversations with other countries in the Gulf are all pieces of this space. So yes, there is an opportunity for rethinking and rediscussing relationships with Turkey. What I can't really see an exit, and I think this could be a discussion forum for this, is that Turkey being inherently aligned to the West, but perceived very different when it comes to foreign policy preferences, and also perceived as enjoying this new multipolarity in the world, create problems for actors like the European Union and the United States even, I would say, yes. But the question, long story very short, the question will be answered, your question will be answered after the elections here. Because then we will also see in the European continent how much we are left alone into our own dynamics in the continent. And in that sense, for example, Turkey will be perceived also a very important part of the rethinking of the continental arrangements, starting with security and defense, then economy and trade, but also in other dimensions of global partnerships that I can get to.
But I dare say that there's not only the election in the US that is an element there, because if you look at elections in Germany recently, in France, in Slovakia, in Italy, the European elections in June, there has been a clear swing to the right, to right-wing parties. What does that mean for the conversation between Turkey and Europe?
I think that's a very, very good point, because maybe for context, we should underline that the European Parliament elections took place in June. The central coalition that were like leading the European Union is still holding, but it became a coalition between the Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, Liberals, and supported by the Greens from outside. And this has become, this negotiation between these political forces at the European level became a political reality. And adding into this picture, we have the rise of the extreme right in Germany, in France. We have a government in Italy, which is the third biggest member state, supported by the extreme right. So we always say, like, I live in Spain, so it's like we always say that Spain is the golden country right now. But all this changes in the European politics is making it really difficult to have conversations with third countries. But this is all happening at the same time, where there's a realization in the European Union that even the biggest country in Europe is too small in this global power competition. So I think this is kind of an interlinked dynamic. It's like we have our politics going towards the right, rise of the extreme right in key member states and the European Union itself, but at the same time, there's a realization that, okay, there's an intensification of China-US rivalry. There are other countries of size of India and others positioning themselves, and as the supranational institution, and even as a continent, also when we look at demographics, because demographics is a very, very important part of this conversation, we are getting smaller and smaller, weaker and weaker. So what we need to see is that how these dynamics will be explained to populations in Europe, and how they will play out when we are discussing relationships with third countries and global partners alike.
I would like now, with your permission, to ask some more newsy questions, Alper, or do you want to intervene now? No? I mean, obviously, the one question news yesterday was the death of Fethullah Gülen. Oh. Can I ask you, what does that mean for US-Turkey relations?
Well, I mean, it will have eliminated one cause of tension through natural intervention, rather than government intervention, which was what Turkey had expected before. So in that sense, you know, it can be positive, but it doesn't mean that the whole issue is going to evaporate, because this is not just about the person itself. There's a structure behind it, and the way that structure will decide to operate will be more critical in understanding how the ultimate impact on the bilateral relationship shall be.
And Sasha, you get the big question. What is your outlook on the US election, and of course the result, whenever we have it? What would the Trump administration mean, and what would the Harris administration mean for Turkey's relations, transatlantic relations, also in the broader context of Russia and Israel, Middle East? Big question, sorry.
Big question.
I know that you can do it in 1 minute 30.
I think that if we start with Russia, part of the problem will be that any next administration will inherit a pretty grim reality that was pre-programmed by decisions taken and not taken this year and late last year. It's just the reality. There is not that much you can do to change the outcome unless the US and the West make just either up the risk appetite and make bold moves that are risky, which I think neither Team Trump or Team Harris anticipate, or you help Ukraine to get their act together, which is also possible but problematic and challenging. So I think that we will end up at a negotiated outcome regardless. Mm-hmm. The problem is that the bigger structural issues with Russia are not going away with either way. There's going to be no detente under Trump, even if it looks like the chemistry between the leaders is working with Putin better than it was before. And like the leaders are again on speaking terms and meeting and talking to each other. That means that the task to establish this deterrence containment framework will remain. And then how well organized the transatlantic family will be and how much Turkey will be in the tent of making that happen, at the same time being one of the channels to talking to the Russians. Because if Russians are interested in meaningful risk reduction mechanisms, probably not arms control yet, but risk reduction, Turkey could be part of this conversation and a channel to have this conversation. But the conversation will happen between Russia and the United States. How much Europeans will make that act together, for example, implement the defense industry part of Draghi report, remains to be seen. I want to be optimistic. I'm skeptical by nature. So I think that here, Trump will be a test. Harris, I think that we will still most likely come to a negotiated outcome at some point down the road. There is other strategy which will be continue to do more or less the same of what you're doing to support Ukraine and hope that Ukraine will weather that and the problems mounting inside Russia will at some point pressure Mr. Putin to climb down the tree. Whether that will happen or not, we will see. The risk, though, is complacency and lack of bold action required. If people say, well, whew, okay, terrific, we dissolve this kind of Trump-proofing European Union task forces that many European capitals run, you know, and just go back to sleep, it's not very helpful a couple of years down the road.
And Ilke, if I may ask you, if it's all hypothetical, of course, but a Trump presidency, looking at his likely policy towards Israel and the Gaza conflict in Lebanon, what would that mean in the relationship between Donald Trump and President Erdogan?
I think the answer to that question is quite difficult because right now what we are seeing there's a long-term kind of limitless intention to change the balance of power in the Middle East. And this is perceived as also quite problematic, by the way, from the European Union side, because Europe is already facing all the problems due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Then the problems between Israel and Hamas were already creating divisions in the EU. We can see that Germany's position is quite different from Spain's and Belgium's and Ireland's, for example. But if we add into all this a longer-term change of dynamics in the Middle East, this is opening up a really volatile space for Europe itself. So in that case, what I'm seeing looking forward, and as I said, I think this is such a dynamic situation that it is really hard to see what will happen next. What I'm seeing when we look at the relationship between the United States, Turkey, and the European Union is that all actors are moving in times of economic transition and in times of global realignments. And when we look at in times of change, we will see that the actors will define, redefine, and redefine their strategies on the go. So it will inherently depend on how things are in Russia-Ukraine war, how things are on the Israel front, and how the administrations in the United States and the European Union approach to each other. I know this is not the journalistic answer that you are looking for, but I think solid academics acknowledge that when pieces move this fast, this rapidly, especially in times of transition, because this is not necessarily a moment of stress, crises, or different wars here and there. This is a moment of transition that includes economy, that includes environment, that includes tech, society, etc., etc. In times of transition, the best we can do is that wait and see and open up spaces for dialogue so that the readjusted interests are expressed correctly.
I think we now go into the room because I get the first live questions. I have some questions here, but so do you want to start, kick the ball first?
I wanted to talk a little bit.
Mike.
I'd love to talk a little bit more about BRICS. So Sinan, Sasha, and the other esteemed colleagues. I want to understand moving forward, is this membership bid likely to progress? I mean, what is the thinking, Sasha, particularly in Moscow? Is this an opportunity to extract, sort of greater concessions from Turkey? If so, what? And to others, how do you think EU or NATO or United States would respond to that if it were the case that membership bid would progress?
I'm skeptical that it will progress this year for sure, because there is tension inside the BRICS on the expansion, and I think that there is no consensus.
Yeah.
So India and Brazil, in particular, are not very happy about the rapid expansion last year, and the narrative is that we need to socialize the new family members inside the family, kind of inject BRICS spirit into them.
It's called absorption capacity.
Yeah, good luck with that, given the various members from Iran to UAE. And only then we will be able to expand. Moscow and China definitely want the rapid expansion, so they want to have a big club that looks serious. I don't think that Moscow will try to extract concessions from Ankara for joining, because it's in Moscow's own interest to expand the club and show the reach and regional capacity to act. But like capacity to act in concert remains the key challenge to BRICS. I don't expect any palpable outcomes from this summit on any of the big issues they are talking, particularly the de-dollarization front. Like the interest is there, but like how to move around that, they have not come up with an idea.
You have more questions?
Take a few if you want. Take a few if you want.
Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Tomas Koren. I'm here with the Czech Embassy. I have two questions. Firstly, regarding relationships with Russia. It could be argued that the coup attempt in 2016 and the issue of regime security was one of the factors that moved Erdogan closer to Russia. I'm wondering whether, for example, if the regime was to become more likely to fall due to elections or popular unrest, whether you see that potentially moving Turkey closer to Russia, and generally speaking about whether Turkey's friendship with Russia follows more Erdogan's will to remain in power rather than Turkish interest, or what is the interplay between those two values? And secondly, if I could, I would like to ask about the Turkish diaspora in Europe, which historically has been economically but also politically significant. But surprisingly enough, we see that very often the Turkish diaspora in the West, for example in Germany, has been very much supporting Erdogan in elections. As a European, I struggle to understand that. Maybe if some of the speakers could maybe shed some light on that phenomena. Thank you.
Who wants to go? Do you want to take that last question first?
No, the first question.
The first question first, okay. And then the second question.
You take the last one.
No.
Well, I think the relationship with Russia, if I understood correctly, I mean, if there's a government change in Turkey, the relationship will change. Because that's one of the dividing lines in terms of how the opposition looks at the world and how the current government looks at the world. And a lot of the relationship with Russia is also driven by what I've already alluded to, which is the loss of momentum at home in terms of democratic reforms. Because in that sense, the relationship with Russia is an easy relationship. There's no conditionality. But it's become much more difficult, when you want to deepen the relationship with Europe and democratic countries. With the change in government, that would change. But it will also depend on what sort of embrace the West would actually demonstrate to a new government in Turkey to sort of give even more incentive to realign itself on the Western wavelength. Because then if, despite Turkey moving in the right direction, we still get the same response, Cyprus, then the game is, then there's not much enthusiasm left for domestic constituency. And therefore, this narrative of strategic autonomy will also gain traction with the side of the Turkish constituency that actually looking forward to a different relationship with the West.
And who wants to take the second question?
I want to go to the same question, connecting it to the BRICS question once again, because I think what we should understand about Turkey is that it shares with South Africa, India, Brazil, and others the reading of the change in the world. It's like the West is in decline, there is a multipolarity, and this multipolarity could be an opportunity for expressing these countries' interests further. And this is seen as in the financial architecture, in the institutional balance, when it comes to the post-Second World War institutions. It comes to the sharing of the costs of the transitions that I have been mentioning. I think this is the common ground for Turkey and other countries in the BRICS setup. While, by the way, I think all the countries in this BRICS, even the first letters of the BRICS require in-depth research, because Brazil is quite different than South Africa. South Africa is quite different than India, and it's very different than Russia and China. Just like for one example, is that India is the most privileged of all because its economy is in a rise. It buys weapons from Russia historically, like 85% of its weaponry. It's doing all kinds of collaborations with the United States because they share this common aim of containing the rise of China. And it has very advantageous agreements with some of the member states in the EU, like Greece, for example, when it comes to maritime security. So it's actually this ideal scenario where you don't need to be historic allies, but you can pick and choose. So actually what Turkey wants to do is exactly the same. It would like to stay as connected, economically connected as possible to the EU so it can receive foreign direct investments and others. It can stay in NATO, so it is in the security umbrella since the Second World War, but at the same time procure S-400s from Russia and even risk an overall security situation with NATO because it can. So I think this is this understanding of multipolarity and opportunities coming from this shifting power balances in the world is common for the BRICS and common for Turkey as such. So I think this is we tend to, us as well. Right? So I have spent the beginning of my career working on Turkey-EU relations, and there we were like having this idea of Turkey is integral to the institutions, NATO member state, candidate country, founding member of Council of Europe. This is just like the starting point of everything. But in 21st century, all these assumptions are changing in the world. So Turkey, like the others, is trying to adapt to the new shifting realities of power in the world.
And in terms of the second question, I mean, of course I have a thought because you talked about Germany, and you will have a thought as well.
I need a sense of purpose.
No, but I really think, I mean, diasporas tend to be more conservative often, but I think Germany is a special case because they saw the Turkish immigrants as Gastarbeiter, as guest workers who would come and then go again. So there was never any effort made to integrate Turks in Germany, and therefore they very much stayed separated in their own world. Especially the first generation didn't speak much German, didn't learn German, didn't really integrate, and then of course their country remained Turkey, and their identity was Turkish. And I guess, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think that contributes also to then having a strong electorate in Germany of Turks voting for Erdogan. It's one of the reasons, I think.
May I jump in on that one?
Yeah, of course.
And two more comments, but first on that question, to try and answer that, I think that's absolutely correct. When you look at the traditional sort of background of the predominant society throughout Europe that has gone there from Turkey,
Alper, your mic is...
mostly come from...
You need to take this.
Oh, I'm sorry, my mic doesn't work. I see. You would notice that they mostly come from conservative backgrounds. So that creates immediately a natural continuum to the AK Party and its political discourse. And of course, Erdogan has been a master politician in the sense that he has been able to galvanize these societies. And he's tapped into the sentiments that are inherent to a predominant number of these societies throughout Europe, particularly in Germany, but not only limited to Germany. And that's how I think you have seen the result that you mentioned, which is really not that surprising if you consider the overall framework. But the drawback for the societies in question, for the Turkish diaspora, is that the way in which the AK Party under President Erdogan has shown that linkage through big meetings and political gatherings in foreign countries has really created a type of backlash in these countries that has been to the detriment of the societies, the very societies that we're talking about. Is there recognition of that? That is another question, but I think it's a two-edged sword in that regard. And now that I've grabbed the mic, may I add one more thing? One thing that has been interesting to me while we did this project, and it came out from everyone's comments, is whichever independent theme, however interrelated they may be, whichever independent theme that we've talked about, and it came out here as well, there's so much tension. Turkey's aspirations, will BRICS work or not? As a NATO country, can it do it, can it not do it? China and so on. In each of these independent themes, there are huge tensions as far as Turkey gravitating in that direction, be it towards Russia, be it towards China and beyond, and its interest in retaining its ties to the West at large, as Sinan mentioned. And I think that has been an interesting observation that is out there, that is known, but with these different baskets of topics, I think that has become more evident in this study. And a veteran Turkish diplomat recently, when he was talking about the application to BRICS, he described Turkey's foreign policy as a piano player that's at discord because it's pressing too many keys at the same time. I don't think, and it boils down to what Sinan said, it's very natural for Turkey in this global landscape to be looking for other opportunities, not to remain, quote unquote, predominantly and only Western-centric in its outlook. But it can do that if, as Sinan said, it eliminates, dispels any doubt as to its main grounding. And that's, I think, what has been missing. And if there were a change in government, I think you would see a correction in that respect, but you would still see a push to ensure that Turkey is not drawn into a direct confrontational relationship with Russia or China, but I think it would be a more palatable Turkey for Turkey's Western partners and allies.
I have one question here on my iPad, if I may. How might Turkey's approach to strategic autonomy change based on the outcome of the US elections? Specifically, would a Trump administration, which is less focused, we assume, on transatlantic relations, create more space for Turkey to pursue its own independent path and perhaps seek closer ties with BRICS? Sinan, do you want to answer that?
I could, partially. I think it would be a bit perhaps premature to really opine about that because there are many conflicting elements in that outcome. On the one hand, you might argue that if Trump were to win, Turkey's relationship with Russia would come under less scrutiny compared to today. So, and that in itself would create, more flexibility for Turkey to pursue its strategic autonomy. On the other hand, you could also argue, and that's my nightmare scenario, that with the concomitant weakening of NATO and NATO deterrence, if Trump actually does what he says he will do, that was going to create an environment in Europe where the Europeans will need to address then their question of almost survival from a security perspective in a way that would be independent from the United States. And the answer that the Europeans will give to that question will matter a great deal for us. And the nightmare scenario is the weakening of NATO and the building up of a European security and defense architecture that excludes Turkey at the same time. That is, that is a future that we would want to avoid. And lastly, again on strategic autonomy, a lot of the discussion here was about the risks of Turkey having this type of strategic autonomy. But if you actually read the papers, which I hope many of you will do and have already done, I'm sure, there's also an opportunity element in this. And this is what we wanted to underline, that a country like Turkey having its own aspirations for strategic autonomy can be a good thing for the transatlantic community, provided that a number of conditions are fulfilled, which we already discussed about. But just to give you an example, if Turkey had not had the urge of strategic autonomy driving its foreign policy, Turkey would not be in Africa. Today, Turkey is in Africa as a real, sizable, and quite critical player. So why don't we think about policies, therefore, given how important it is for the transatlantic community to steer towards a policy of, I would say, containing China globally, and in Africa particularly. So therefore, that strategic autonomy impetus, which has driven Turkey to Africa, can be a positive dynamic in creating the foundations of a closer alliance between Turkey and its Atlantic partners. So therefore, the strategic autonomy should not necessarily be seen as a risk, but there are also opportunities which we try to underline here.
I'm seeing now, wow, 1, 2, 3.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah, but could we maybe gather these questions? So would you start with your question, then we go to you next, and then follow that.
I'm Alan Makowski from the Center for American Progress. I guess my question is for Alexander. There's been a lot of talk about how the S-400 issue might be finessed. I guess the most recent idea out there is that the S-400s be kept in Incirlik, a place where the Americans can keep an eye on it. I'm just curious, how do you think Moscow would react to some of these various ideas? If Turkey were, let's say, to leave it on Incirlik under Americans' watchful eye, or to destroy it, or to give it to a third country. Ukraine has been mentioned. Turkey has ruled most of these things out, of course. Azerbaijan. I'm sure part of Turkey's calculus will be how Moscow will react, and I just wonder if you could play with that a bit, and maybe if Sinan wants to talk about how he thinks Turkey assesses these various proposals.
And then we have another question, the gentleman with the blue shirt in the back there. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Kani Zulam. I'm a Kurdish dissident from Turkey. Politics, it looks like, moves with the speed of light in Turkey. Erdogan and his partners in the government are talking about having Öcalan address his fans in the Turkish parliament. What prompted it? Is peace possible inside Turkey? What will it mean about Turkey's place in the Middle East?
Do you want to start with this question first, Sasha? I think that was mainly to you, and then I don't know who you want to talk about.
I don't know what they think now. I think that there is an acute need of more air defense pieces in Russia itself.
Yeah.
If it can get it back, actually, that would probably be an ideal outcome. Because you see that a lot of contracts that have been agreed between Russia and India, Russia is not able to fully implement them because Ukrainians, with a lot of Western help, managed to destroy a lot of air defense pieces. And next year, if the fighting drags on, which is likely, the Ukrainians are developing fleet of their own long strike capabilities, be it drone or be it ballistic missiles. So Russia will need a lot of air defense pieces that they cannot produce. So getting this stuff back might
Could be portrayed as Turkey acceding to a request from Moscow.
We'll see. I think that they will find a mutually agreeable solution for the optics, but that's probably something where it's
And Ellen, and getting yet another time sanctions by Katsa because we transacted with Russia on the S-400 by sending it back.
Ilke, you wanted to?
Actually, I wanted to go back a bit on the strategic autonomy question because I think this is very important. And the strategic autonomy conversation in Europe is about having choices. No, it's like this is the starting point. And when we are moving from this historical alliances towards having choices in international relationship framework, I also see some kind of opportunity for relationships, but if we have diplomacy in play, if we have clever multilateralism at play, there's a really good article from Carnegie Europe actually saying that even inside the EU, we need informality, flexibility, creating coalitions of the willing. So what I wanted to add to the strategic autonomy, and if this is a possibility or opportunity for improving relations with third countries like Turkey, I think this is also going to be not necessarily going to the European Union itself as a supranational institution of 27, but also it will very much depend on Turkey's bilateral relationships with specific member states, and if it is able to create coalitions of the willing when it comes to different issues, no? Security and defense, green transition, using tech, all these dual use goods conversations. I think we are entering also to a new period in international relations in general, but in this kind of conversations between the EU member states and third countries, where this unilateral formats and bilateral relationships will be more important than overall institutional frameworks.
And who wants to answer the more domestic question? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, before I do, just on the S-400, because that's my, as you know, Alan, I've been, writing this about a lot. I think in sending it to the third country is just a non-starter. That's never going to happen. The İncirlik formula, perhaps, but that still doesn't fulfill the condition of seized possession. But in any case, if we're going to solve it, the US has to move on that. There's no way to solve this with the seized possession in existence. So something must happen in Congress with the NDA in the next version, whatever understanding we have with the US government. The other formula, which to me could actually be interesting, is if Turkey were to move this to an overseas Turkish base, but far away, like Somalia or Qatar, and it would stay there. We have, a very long-term lease in Somalia, 99 years. So it wouldn't be seized possession formally, but I mean, you can't really imagine all that material being shipped back. It's very complicated in times of crisis. So maybe there are arrangements like that that could be explored if there is goodwill. And there seems to be some goodwill now to explore this, to just get rid of this problem forever and all. Now, on what you have referred to, it was very surprising. Nobody really expected this. And the Turkish society split about this initiative. My personal belief is that actually if this is managed well, this would be a good thing for Turkish democracy, because now on that basis, we could possibly create a parliamentary commission that would essentially devise and deliberate about how to do democratic reforms in Turkey. So if we get there, and if the government is actually sincere, then that might lead to good democratic outcomes for the country as a whole. And therefore, this is an opportunity that should be squandered. Of course, the motivation is not to democratize the country. Let's not kid ourselves. The motivation is for Erdogan to win backing in parliament from the Kurdish party for yet another round of, for him to be able to stand for yet another round in elections. But that's fine, that's politics. If it leads to a good outcome for the country in terms of democratic rule, so much the better.
I think I saw at least 2 more questions. Oh, 3, 4.
Fine.
Shall we try to, because we have only 17 minutes left, shall we try to nice and shortly gather them? And I start here, and then we go that way, yeah?
Kathy Kosman, a very perhaps all too obvious question, but there are so many peoples within the former Soviet Union and Russia who are of Turkic origin, or at least, way back when they're linked ethnically and in other ways, also religiously, to Turkey. Is that a factor?
Okay, Sasha, what do you know?
Mm-hmm.
And then
Shall we collect that?
Yeah,
Or
let's collect
let's
questions.
collect
Yeah, okay.
them? Yeah.
No, we collect questions. Yeah. I don't know who was next.
Yeah.
I think this gentleman there, yeah.
Thank you. Herbert Regenbogen. I'm a law fellow at Columbus School of Law at Catholic University and a professor at Kent University in Istanbul. My question actually governs the entire array of discourse, where primarily there's one very central figure of the topic, which has not been even pronounced, the rule-based order. So this is really surprising. And when we speak of a rule-based order, with all its dynamics and multipolarity, the question really asks, what is the direction, ultimately, of going backwards into the 19th century or going forward? And in that realm, we speak of the rule-based order, or specifically a understanding about the principles of an international world order. And those principles are governance. And that entire list of governance, democracy, foreign policy, domestic policy, is anchored in that one concept. So my question really is, where are we going? Are we really ultimately convinced that we can find the cooperation to meet the crisis? And I don't mean wars and revolution. I mean environmental. Because that is the major crisis. And while we speak of all these different topics, ultimately we don't speak of the most important crisis. And so how do you integrate all these dynamics ultimately into an operational framework for foreign policy and domestic policy? Thank you.
Okay. And the next question here, yeah.
Hi, I'm Phyllis Berry from the National Intelligence Council. Just to follow up on the Africa part, I mean, Turkey does have a presence there. Really, what are the concrete opportunities are there for Western, either US or European partnership with Turkey there? I mean, because it seems like it can be contradictory. On one hand, Turkey also reinforces some of the anti-Western rhetoric and messaging that they see beneficial that coming from Russia and China, yet, China usually doesn't partner with other countries in other parts of the world. So is there really an opportunity there? And this is a big question, but if we look at the war in Ukraine, what are the lessons that Turkey is taking from it? I mean, and have they changed? You know, at the beginning, again, there was a lot of talk about their UAVs. Their UAVs don't look so, you know, don't look as appealing as they were. It does look like Russia will persist. Have their, you know, has the Turkish perception of whatever lessons they're getting out of that war changed?
And the last question, you've been waiting very patiently.
Hi, my name is Alper Coşkun from the Washington Institute, and my question is that one sticking point in EU-Turkish relations would be the Eastern Mediterranean and Cyprus, as you emphasized multiple times. What do you think would be the ideal and also likely resolution of this conflict between the EU and Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean?
Okay, Sasha, do you want to start with the lady's question on?
Sure, I think it's a factor, and you see that Turkey is trying to build its influence and increase outreach, particularly to the Turkic-speaking countries in Central Asia. My colleague Temur Umarov in Berlin is working a lot on these issues. So when there is a nation state, definitely there is an increased outreach. And since these countries are in a precarious position where they share tough neighborhood with Russia and China that are increasingly closely aligned, and there is a lot of overlap in interests of those countries, the five want to act more together, build resilience, and outreach to outside players creates options and room, maneuvering space for them. So Turkey's outreach is met halfway with a lot of enthusiasm. And then there is a question, how do you make that in practical terms? Like there is a lot of investment, a lot of business ties, and a lot of thinking on how to make the logistics around the Caspian Sea be more economically attractive. There is some outreach to the Turkic-speaking minorities in Russia, but the Kremlin and Moscow pay a very close attention to that outreach. So it's there, but it's much more muted, I would say.
And the second question on the where's the rules-based order gone? Who can? Ilke, you want to? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think this is a very, very good question, and this is not discussed only in the West. This is discussed very much also in the countries that we call the plural South or the global South. I was in South Africa last week, and this is one of the questions that they ask continuously as well, because I think in the West, we need to realize that what we call rules-based order are the rules that were designed by the winners of the Second World War and mostly the Western Alliance. And the disagreement in the 20th century is not necessarily helping resolving conflicts in the 21st century. And when I say conflicts, I don't just mean armed conflicts like what is happening in Ukraine right now. I also mean like how to finance green transition, how to fight against tech giants, how to help countries in extreme poverty, how to restructure debt so that most of the countries in the plural South don't spend their income on repaying debt instead of saving power from poverty, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, I totally understand the urge and the desire to say what is happening with the rules-based order. I think we are entering into a period, if the Western countries, and I personally see very much of an opportunity for the European Union there, if it would like to seize it, to open the conversation and open the space of a re-agreement on the what we call rules-based order in the 21st century. If we don't do it, if the European Union and others do not voluntarily open up the space, if they just discuss, and this is a conversation in the G20 space, by the way. This is the most common conversation in the G20 space in India, in South Africa, and then it's Brazil, and then it's the United States. So I really see an opportunity, window of opportunity here to have this conversation openly and fairly. Then we will see the strengthening of other kind of unilateral and organizations, setups like BRICS and IPSA and others. So if the West is really willing to have some kind of an order in the world, it is the time to open up this conversation so that there's an agreement in the 21st century. I really see this as an opportunity, and really it's in the Western interest to open up the conversation, to open up what really is rules-based order, what constitutes it, what kind of power dynamics to be rediscussed in institutions, so that we can have this inclusive 21st century order, because otherwise it's going to be a disordered multipolarity, what will come out of this.
Next was the question on Western partnerships in Africa and lessons from the war in Ukraine.
I'll take the Africa question.
Africa, yeah, it's your specialty.
There are several dimensions of what the prospect of a Turkey-West cooperation in Africa could bring about. And I would summarize them in three baskets. One is stabilization, one is security, and one is economic development. Think along those lines. When you look at what Turkey is doing nowadays in Africa, let's start with stabilization. I mean, it would be unthinkable just a few years ago to think that Turkey is the country that is most diplomatically active in trying to settle the Ethiopia-Somalia disagreement. Turkey is doing that in the east of Africa. That's the most visible, most recent diplomatic activity at the highest level, with the backing of Erdogan, with the foreign minister himself being involved in already 3 rounds of negotiations, delegations coming to Turkey and so on, papers being exchanged. So there are areas where politically, and Turkey has no real agenda there in terms of, trying to advance any other power's agenda, apart from stabilization. So that's one area. The other one area is defense, where you see also now the footprint of Turkish defense industries led by sales of, armed drones. What that does is, these are countries that are either going to buy from China or from Turkey. They're not going to buy from the US. They don't have that sort of budget. So when Turkey comes in, it comes into the detriment of China. And it builds up an ecosystem around that industry, because there needs to be training done, there needs to be equipment that needs to be taken place, and that paves the path, either before or after, to even more robust defense industry, but also security sector reform type cooperation, trainings, and so on. So that's the second area where Turkey is quite active. The third area is in terms of economic, basically public works construction, infrastructure construction. And again there, it's an alternative to what China is doing, because China is doing some of these things for political leverage, if not to say debt trap type situations. Turkey's model is very different. It's very different because our economic actors that go there are essentially very profit maximizing actors. They don't go there for political purposes. We don't have that sort of state market relationship like China. It's much less corporatist in nature. And therefore, those that go there with all the know-how that they have, and Turkey's been really in the vanguard of countries, along with China, by the way, in terms of global construction efforts, they have the know-how, they do the work. And therefore, what Turkey is lacking is the finance part. So therefore, these type of trilateral cooperation between, EU instruments like Global Gateway, the US engagement as well, that would onboard Turkey, would make this offer much more competitive in Africa. The reason why the Western companies are not competitive is that they just don't have this type of skilled labor that can do that the way that Turkish contractors do. But where Turkey is not competitive is they don't have the funding to do it at scale. So that would be a marriage, that would be, very much appreciated. And just one sentence on the rules-based order.
One.
Just one, because it was asked, where are we in terms of the rules-based order? I think we're somewhere between League of Nations and the UN. That's where we are. we've regressed.
Sasha, I have only 2 minutes, and actually I think it's Alper's turn to talk now. And could you, I'm sorry, I know there are some questions left, could you maybe answer them bilaterally after the event, because there's only 2 minutes and these are yours, Alper.
Thank you, Stephanie. Let me start out by thanking you as our moderator. But let me quickly also go to the Ukraine question, because I did want to respond to that. There is an important lesson learned, I think. Remember when Russia stepped into the Syrian theater, that was seen as Russia brandishing its weapons and as sort of a stepping stone to Russia building the sails of its defense industry. Well, what happened in Ukraine, I think, is, yes, in Ukraine, in terms of Turkey's perception, is that this visceral and ill-choreographed idea that Turkey's defense industry future might even have a marriage with Russia or other technologies other than those that are Western-originated or NATO standards has collapsed. Hence, you see Turkey now walking away from romantic ideas that were voiced at the time of buying Russian aircraft back to the F-16. So that is an important dynamic, I think, that has come into play. I'll end with that content-wise, but I want to thank all of you for joining us today. If you allow me, I'd like to give a hand particularly to our moderator, but also to our fantastic panelists. I was a sideshow, as you saw, but I also want to thank my other colleagues who contributed to all of the projects, and thank you to all your questions.
4 o'clock.